Today, we're diving into a book that asks a really tough question. What if the war in Ukraine isn't just about one leader or recent politics, but is actually woven into the very fabric of Russian culture over hundreds of years? That is the bold, provocative argument of Mikhail Zygar's book, War and Punishment, and we're going to unpack his incredible journey through that history. And right from the very first sentence, you can feel how personal this is for Zygar. He's not pulling any punches. He says, this book is a confession. He's not just some detached historian. He's putting himself and Russian culture as a whole right in the middle of the story. This isn't just history. It's a raw, introspective look from the inside out. So, to really get a handle on Zygar's argument, here's how we're going to break it down. First up, we'll look at that confession and why he felt he had to write this book. Then, we'll see how he weaves this story across centuries. After that, we're going to boil it all down to 3 critical lessons. And finally, we'll take a step back and look at the book's strengths and, of course, its limitations. So what makes an author write a book that he calls a confession? Well, for Zygar, it goes way deeper than just chronicling the events of a war. And here it is, the book's central and, you have to say, very controversial idea. Zygar is basically arguing that this war isn't just the fault of one person or a single political moment. No, he suggests that Russian culture itself, its myths, its art, its literature, has created this imperial mindset that made the conflict, well, not just possible, but maybe even inevitable. And to prove his point, he goes all the way back, like way back, to the 1600s. He highlights this one text called Synopsis, which basically set up the idea that Kiev was the cradle of the entire Russian state. And he argues that this single idea became the blueprint for generations of Russian historians, creating this foundational myth that Russia has some kind of natural historical right to Ukraine. It's an idea with some seriously long legs. Okay, so how on earth do you tell a story that stretches over 350 years? Well, Zygar's approach is really unique. He builds a narrative that's designed to draw these straight, unmissable lines between the past and what's happening right now. So instead of a simple, straight timeline, the book kind of jumps between these huge, pivotal moments. It connects the Cossack rebellions in the 1650s with Peter the Great's imperial dreams, then jumps to the national awakening inspired by the poet Taras Shevchenko, and then links all of that to the fall of the Soviet Union and, finally, to the invasion in 2022. He's literally drawing parallels right across time. And his method for doing this is really a 3-step process. First, he makes history personal. He tells this giant story through the lives of individuals, from czars to poets. Second, he's constantly showing you historical parallels, how things that were said in the 18th century sound eerily similar to what leaders say today. And third, and this is crucial, he shows how culture isn't just entertainment. It actively shapes political reality. All right, let's get to the real heart of it. We've taken this huge, sprawling history and distilled it down into 3 critical takeaways. These are the absolute core lessons that pop out from his centuries-long story. The first big lesson is that what we're witnessing today is nothing new. The book makes a really forceful case that Russia's imperial ambition, this idea that it has a right to control its neighbors, that Ukrainian identity is somehow fake or lesser, is a constant thread that runs through its entire history, from the Tsars through the Soviets all the way to today. Let me give you a concrete example from the book. Back in the 18th century, you have Catherine the Great. She's often seen as this enlightened ruler, right? Well, she methodically forced serfdom onto Ukraine. And Zygar points out this wasn't just about economics. It was a deliberate political weapon meant to wipe out Ukrainian autonomy and just absorb it. The goal was to destroy its distinctness. Okay, now let's fast forward more than 200 years. It's 2008, and Vladimir Putin says this to George W. Bush. The words are different, of course, but the underlying message, it's strikingly similar to Catherine's actions. The idea that Ukraine doesn't have a right to its own choices, that its very existence is conditional on Russia's say-so. The book is just filled with these kinds of historical echoes. Now, the second key takeaway shifts the camera, and it focuses on Ukraine. The book argues that Ukrainian resistance for centuries has been fundamentally different from Russian rebellions. It's not just been about grabbing power or getting rid of a bad ruler. It's been this persistent, ongoing struggle for the very right to exist as a separate nation with its own unique culture and language. And this comparison here is really central to the whole argument. The book contrasts something like Pugachev's rebellion in Russia, which was a huge uprising, but it just fizzled out because it lacked a unifying idea. It contrasts that with Ukrainian movements. Whether you're talking about the poetry of Shevchenko, the student hunger strikes in 1990, or the Maidan protests, Zygar says the fuel for the fire in Ukraine has always been a fight for national and cultural survival. The third and final lesson is, well, it's probably the most chilling one. It's this idea that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It's something that is actively twisted, manipulated, and then used as a weapon to justify political ambitions in the here and now.
And Zygar lays out this devastating timeline of how it's done. Back in the 18th century, a famous scientist is told to write a history that only highlights Russia's glory. Then, in the 20th century, a young KGB agent, Vladimir Putin, learns about Ukrainian nationalism, not from history books, but from a fictional spy novel that paints them all as fascists. Fast forward to the 21st century, and Russian state TV is just inventing horrific stories to stir up hatred. And then, finally, Putin becomes the historian himself, writing these massive articles that rewrite the past to justify what he's doing in the present.
So we've walked through the core arguments of the book. But with any big historical work like this, it's so important to look at it critically, to understand what it does really well, but also to be aware of the specific lens it's looking through. Right, because this isn't just a list of facts, right? It's a narrative, and it has a really powerful personal mission behind it. So let's break down what works and where you might want to read with a critical eye. First off, the strengths are just undeniable. The book is so readable. By telling the story through people, he turns what could be really dry history into this gripping human drama. And its real superpower is drawing those lines from the past to the present, making you see today's headlines in a totally different way. Plus, he brings in all this amazing cultural detail, like a Soviet-era comedy show called KVN, that both Zelensky and a lot of Kremlin figures were a part of, to show how identity gets forged in some really unexpected places. But it's also fair to think about some potential limitations. I mean, because the book draws such a straight, clean line from the 1600s to 2022, you could argue it feels a little deterministic, almost like this was the only possible outcome. The story is also deeply shaped by the author's own identity as a Russian liberal. That confession of guilt really frames everything. And finally, because it focuses so much on czars, poets, and presidents, it sometimes gives less airtime to the broader social and economic forces that were also shaping things from the bottom up. And yet, despite all the heavy history Zygar details, the book also really captures this incredible spirit of defiance. This quote from Volodymyr Zelensky, which he said after Russia attacked civilian infrastructure, just perfectly sums up that whole theme of self-determination. It's basically a declaration that Ukrainian identity doesn't depend on Russia. It exists in spite of it, and it will keep existing without it. And that really brings us to the final huge question the book kind of leaves hanging in the air. Zygar has painstakingly shown us this historical path of empire and resistance that led straight to this war. So, what happens now? If this is the history we're all dealing with, what does it tell us about the path forward? Not just for Ukraine and Russia, but for all of us. And that's the question this really powerful book forces you to confront.